first of all, from like a clinical perspective, shame, we know, leads to really negative outcomes. So shame, I am a bad person. I am horrible. I am awful. That is a space that is highly correlated with depression and anxiety, even suicidality. So that is just like unhealthy for everybody. Like, it's just not good for you, right? Now, guilt, that's good, right? Guilt is, I did something wrong. I've done something wrong and I need to change, right? It allows us to move to a space of change. So one of the first places that I will challenge them is in that shame guilt space, right? Is how do we move from like a shame space that you are so bad and you are awful to, oh, like I did something wrong. And then a lot of times I'll just bring in like just small examples. It's kind of like, like watering something a little bit at a time, right? Well, like, so that's what Jesus did. He came in and he told them how horrible they were. Definitely when they caught that woman in adultery, he picked up all the stones and he threw them at her, right? I mean, let's do it too. And then they go, right? They just sort of pause and they're like, no, he didn't. Actually, he told everybody to put them down.
Good afternoon. My name is Graham Durgee, and I'm the founder and CEO of New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families.
People will say, what kind of therapy do you do? Pretty much everything but addiction. Although I am trained in brain spotting, which I love, and I have been trained in the addiction setup for brain spotting. So what I will often do with addictions counselors is say, if you would like for us to work together and have your person come and just do brain spotting with me, I do that sometimes. But recap, I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor. That's a mouthful, formerly LPC in North Carolina. I've been in practice about 10 years, but I've been with the practice as a whole for a very long time because my parents are Bev and Tom Rogers, who found the practice, and they've been in Charlotte for about 40 years. They have a marital model that they created, or it's actually a model of therapy. I shouldn't say just marital, because we do have an individual healing the soul track and then the soul healing love track, which is for couples. And it is based in imago relationship theory, family systems theory, as well as some cognitive behavioral principles. And I do host our podcast called the Soul Healing Love Podcast, which is why I'm in studio today, which was much easier than me worrying about my Chrome at home. I was like, I don't know, my Mac is old. So I do host a podcast as well. And I work with people of all ages. So I see kids, I see teens, I see individuals. Soul Healing Love is a heavy trauma-focused therapy. I was like looking at some of y'all's podcasts and like that trauma is a big focus. So we talk a lot about what happens in the brain and what happens when we get triggered. We call it an old brainer. I am very heavily into learning more and more about body-based regulation, because I think when we, more and more what we are understanding about the brain is that to come at it from a thinking standpoint is just pointless, right? It's not like the majority of what's happening isn't coming from our thinking brain. So how am I going to think it into a better state? So I love learning about brain spotting, which is more body-based, which has led me down a trail into a program I'm trained in called MATES brain regulation, which has to do with, it's much like polyvagal theory and kind of how to bring regulation, how to get us back to that window of tolerance. But that's something that I love because, it's really in our body. So we have to, move into that.
Very cool.
That's a little bit about me.
Yeah. So, I just have, and I guess some of this will come up in the podcast, but it does seem there's a big theme with spirituality, and it seems like that's a very centric part of your approach to therapy. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, and I always tell people we are all licensed. So I think that's really important because, sometimes you want to have the biblical underpinning and a Christian worldview with someone who is very, understands psychology and understands trauma. But yes, looking at, when we are in states of dysregulation, when we're stuck in depression, we aren't living in a space to be as the people that God created us to be, right? That we could actually move into our best states when we're stuck there. So we use psychological principles, biblical principles, whatever it takes. And it's also meeting people where they are, because some people are really comfortable with that. Some people have had some religious trauma. And so we have to be very sensitive to what's going on.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Hey Amanda, I'm Dr. Hong, go by Harold, but people usually insist on calling me Dr. Hong or some variation of that. But let's see, so I'm the medical director here. Lived in North Carolina for like close to 20 years, but born and raised in Ohio. Spirituality and faith has been a big part of my life growing up, and like we don't really talk a lot about it explicitly here, which it's like there's this is it a boundary issue? Like, how personal do we get? Like how quickly do we get into that topic? But it is also like front and center on the 12-step model.
Right. I was
And,
going to ask, are you guys 12-step based? Because it's like front and center is, are we submitting to a higher power to realize that we can't do this on our own?
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Yeah, so we're not necessarily 12-step based. However, the nature of what we do, I mean, 12 steps and other, kind of approaches to recovery are interwoven into everything that we do. And we do bring in some outside community support groups, which are very heavily 12-step based, but we also do like some refuge recovery and things like that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also coming from a background of ways in which spirituality was used probably like in an unhealthy way, in ways that led to people feeling overwhelmed and and really in very damaging ways, actually. So
Yeah.
it's something that's like deeply personal, like completely core and foundational, but also something that I just talk about with extreme sense of respect and safety. Approach it very carefully, very cautiously, with a lot of sense of like permission to pass or to, disengage from the conversation.
Yes.
Probably because of my personal experience with spirituality being used like out of hand or in some ways which I think are just not functional or healthy. So love to talk about that because I think that's a lot of what a lot of our clients are facing is the idea that they're being like forced into a certain model of spirituality. Like they're like if they're not Christian, if they're atheists, then they can't engage in recovery or engage in
Right.
accessing a higher power. And these are deep waters, but just kind of setting the table
We're supposed to
for
be in new waters, not deep waters.
yeah, but sometimes new waters are deep waters. So
True. Well, so from the Christian's perspective, there was a podcast that came out. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but it's called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Mars Hill was a very
yeah,
large.
totally keyed into that big time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was it was a bit triggering for me that I only got about halfway through because there's also currently on Hulu a 4-part docuseries about the Duggar family and the organization that they came from. And so there's my personal opinion is that Christians need to sit back and realize that now we can look at both of those situations and realize that there was a very strong narcissist at the helm and a lot of principles that were really unhealthy. And we can look at it now and say that. But the problem is what we're not looking at, and what the last episode of that docuseries, Shiny Happy People, talks about is the very insidious and subtle infiltration that those extreme principles from, not just those two, but those are two that we have documented now, right? From Bill Gothard and his organization and Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill that have been interwoven into mainstream Christianity that then become much more power oriented and less Jesus like. Now, that is some of my opinion, but
And
That's
Hulu
where
did
I
the
sit.
other thing on Hillsongs, which was like another
Oh,
huge
yes, I haven't watched that one yet
Yeah.
because they're
controversy.
all very, like, it's like
I know.
I had to have friends talk me into the Shiny Happy People one because I was like, "I'm not gonna watch that. I'm not doing it." And they're like, "No,
Yeah.
you really." I'm like, "I'm not. No, I couldn't." And then it
Uh,
was only 4 parts, and I'm glad I did. But yeah, it's just where
mhm.
you see abuse of power over and over and over again.
Yep.
So I think that's, to kinda say what you're saying, yeah, that, you have to be very sensitive to where people are and to their story, which I think goes back to the trauma because religion and spirituality can be traumatizing just like anything else. And so being exceptionally
Mhm.
aware that before I wade into anything, your brain has an old brain story that's not up here in your conscious brain. It's back in your amygdala, it's back in your limbic system that is going to hijack your body as well around anything. And that can include religion and spirituality.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Um, so I guess I should introduce
Yeah.
myself too, right? So I'm Justin Mclendon. I'm the executive director here at New Waters. I am also a licensed clinical mental health counselor and been doing clinical work for what feels like a lifetime now. Especially since we're on the subject of spirituality. So I'll just share a little bit of that story. So I was actually grew up in Alabama and Georgia, very Southern Baptist kind of upbringing, and I think it was just kind of what we did, right? I mean, I grew up kind of, believing in the faith and things like that. And then had my own experiences with active addiction in my late adolescence, early 20s, and really had this interesting kind of thing where I just kind of walked away from it. I had a lot of confusion, was trying to just figure out kind of what it meant for me. I look back on that period as kind of like the lost years of my life when it comes to connection and, spiritual connection and things like that. But uh, through my own personal recovery, like I was able to, find that again for myself, and then also had the opportunity to kind of redefine what that meant for me and what was important for me when it came to that. And I think because of some of those experiences, a lot of my clinical work and just interests and research that I've really dived into has been very centric to spirituality and like the importance of developing connection, healthy connections with ourselves and the world around us, and
Yeah.
identifying what a higher power means to us and those types of things. So I'm really excited about this, being able to have the opportunity to chat with you. And Dr. Hong and I actually have another podcast we're doing later today, just the two of us, that's on spirituality. So it's just going to be a smooth day, I think, right?
So it'll be like that's a theme. When
That's
it's
the
a theme,
theme.
it's important. I talked to my friend the other day and I said, I just learned about this one thing. And she goes, the person I talked to right before you just said that. I said,
Yeah,
okay, well, that means that God's bringing it to you. Like, you got to do it,
there you go.
obviously.
I love it. I
Mhm.
love it. All right. So
Okay.
should we get
Cool.
started?
Yeah.
So you're going to
Right.
ask me then to give an introduction of myself. Is that right?
Mhm.
That would be
Correct.
okay. I was
Yeah.
just make sure I sound proficient.
I'm sure you'll get it. You're effortlessly, no problem.
There we go.
Hopefully.
Okay. All right. Do you just go by Amanda Rogers Cumbo, or is it any
Yeah. Cumbo is
Cumbo?
like gumbo. I know.
Gumbo.
It's
There we go.
Cumbo. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to welcome Amanda Rogers Sorry, Gumbo. Today we're welcoming Amanda Rogers Cumbo. Amanda, thanks so much for joining the New Waters podcast today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just, I feel exceptionally honored and have an immense amount of gratitude just to both of you, to all of New Waters to be here. So thank you.
Great.
It's our pleasure.
Well, just so that everyone can get to know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice?
Absolutely. My name, as you said, Amanda Rogers Cumbo. I work with Rogers Christian Counseling. It is a Christian counseling practice here in Charlotte that has been here for about 40 years. My mom started it, and then my dad joined her. My mom is a marital and family therapist. My dad is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and it's just grown from there. I grew up here in Charlotte. I am one of the few that is born and raised here. And then actually, planned on being a medical doctor. So I was 3 years into my biology degree in Chapel Hill and decided I don't really think this is my path. And, mom and dad do this. And I think that might be more what I'm interested in. But it's actually been so beautiful because I nerd out on neuroscience. So having that biology background is really beautiful with how neuroscience and psychology have grown. Um, so I have my master's in Christian counseling from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which was a nice marriage of everything for state licensure, which I think is really important, on top of a good bit of theology and spirituality training. So our goal at Rogers Christian Counseling is to bring all of the psychological healthy principles. I think we are all licensed either as licensed marital family therapists or licensed clinical mental health counselors, but we all also have some biblical training and have a biblical worldview underpinning. So, for people who that is important to them, they have a safe space to do really healthy psychological work with a space for a shared marriage of what's going on with their spirituality as well. I've been in practice about 10 years, and one of my great loves is brain spotting, which kind of began as more of a trauma therapy, but truly you can use it with so many people. So I work with kids, I work with teens, I work with individuals and couples. One thing that makes our practice very unique is my parents did develop a model of therapy called soul healing love, which has foundations in imago relationship theory, family systems theory, along with a good bit of cognitive behavioral work as well, because we have a motto that says, if nothing changes, nothing changes. We can bring awareness to these cycles and these patterns, but if you're not actually doing something different, then we're just going to stay where we are. And within that, I do host our podcast, which is the Soul Healing Love podcast. And we had done workshops for many years, couples workshops. So when COVID hit, we were like, what are we going to do? Are we going to have in-person workshops now? So we actually have 2 courses that we developed online, one for couples, which is the Soul Healing Love couples workshop online, and we have a track for individuals as well called Healing the Soul. So in my everyday life, I am either chasing my 2 boys who are quite loud, or I am working with people, sitting, talking with them, hopefully helping them find healing.
Great. Well, I think your background is so interesting because many of the people we love working with are dealing with lots of emotional pain on a daily basis, and their connection to God or their own spirituality is a huge part of how they take care of themselves on a daily basis. Very common story, people will drink heavily Friday night, Saturday night, got to make it to church on Sunday, and rinse and repeat for the weeks and
Yeah,
weeks.
cause for forgiveness. I'll just go out and do it again. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Mhm.
so spirituality and emotional pain and addiction, all the following attending processes, are a huge part of everyone's life. But very few people have your background where they can speak to both parts of that.
Mm.
And a lot of them are completely unaware that there's anything unhealthy about their rhythm of using, self medicating, and then going to church and trying to have an active spiritual life at the same time. Uh, can you tell me your experience, like what that looks like from your side as someone who's deeply, trained in both sides of this story? And for anyone who's wondering, is this okay? Or do I need help? How would you talk to them about that?
Well, kind of approaching everything as like helping them get to their own awareness. But, it's interesting because that actually sounds like part of an addiction cycle to me, right? Where like part of the addiction itself is actually the relief that they're attempting to feel by going to church. And is that even actually part of the cycle itself? But then there is the piece of like, okay, well, is this a problem? Well, usually once we start asking that question, then that's our first clue that it's a problem. On top of the fact of, this recognition of, are they sitting in a space of action-oriented faith, which really is not the grace space that we want them to be in, or that I want them to be in from a faith
Mhm.
perspective.
Just listening to you explain that, a thought came up for me is that, and I think just in something that we face here in my own clinical practice, even in my own personal life, I think, you know, you mentioned that part of that addiction cycle is that they are seeking that relief. Completely agree with that. And I think, when we're trying to work with a client to get them to kind of see that for themselves, to develop that awareness, I'm sure you experience this too, Amanda, that a lot of times there's that resistance there, right? And especially when the conversations start to drift in any kind of a spiritual kind of context, there seems to be, not all the time, right? But sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, that resistance kind of putting the brakes on. And just curious as to what your thoughts are. I know for me, it seems like a lot of times there could be um, some spiritual trauma there, some preconceived notions about what that may be, fear for a variety of different reasons. But just kind of interested, what's been your experience with that?
Yes. Well, one thing that's a little bit different is, we are branded as a Christian counseling practice. So
Mhm.
people are going to come in knowing that that's going to be a part of it. But then
Right.
it's very important to begin to unpack, like, what is their church history? What has been their experience? Because some of it has been good. Some of it's been really positive, and then some have been through an immense amount of trauma. Or they went to a church because they were forced to go growing up. Or again, there were a lot of preconceived notions when they were younger of what was told and taught that maybe they don't resonate with, or they don't understand, or they didn't even really, it wasn't an option. Right? It's like, this is just what we did. So when you really unpack of, like, the goal of Christianity as I see it, and if you really look at the person of Jesus, is to develop a relationship with him. When you're in a relationship with somebody, you're not going to do everything perfectly. There are going to be ruptures. There are going to be needs for repair, kind of looking at it from an attachment perspective. And, how do we do that? But if you have been taught that to be a Christian means to follow a bunch of rules, or you have some type of shame-based theology where everything is good, bad, black, white, right, wrong, then there's going to be a lot of guilt and shame. There's probably going to be a lot of trauma. Like we said, with trauma, I think one of the things that's so critical is that trauma creates an unconscious story that I tell myself all the time. You are unconsciously running that narrative all the time, and it is consistently informing your behavior. And if part of your story of church is that, people who go to church are really mean, or, the pastor is going to yell at me, or it's exceptionally authoritarian, and there's, like, I have to submit, and I don't have a will, and I, can't do anything for myself, or I'm so bad. There are certain, I'm more non-denominational. My dad was a pastor when I was young. We went to a lot of different churches, of different denominations, and I think I just tease that I pick on all of them in therapy, because they all have a little bit of a theology they think is right and potentially wrong. Because, you know, someone can look at the Bible and they can be like, okay, this is exactly what it is. Like, yeah, but okay, the Southern Baptists think that, and the Presbyterians think that, and the Methodists think that, but they're all basing it on the same Bible. So, like, maybe like my perspective is perhaps we should zoom out and see, like, what are themes. So context
Mhm.
and theme, and in my opinion, person of Jesus is absolutely critical when challenging those old stories. But just like with any type of trauma, we have to approach those stories very delicately, because they're not being informed by our prefrontal cortex. They're being informed by our limbic system. And our limbic system is much more powerful in that moment. As one of my mentors says, then your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system become at war. So instead of being integrated and helping you make healthy decisions about what you want your spirituality to look like, when I'm being triggered, those two parts are at war. I actually had a client recently. It was the most beautiful thing in the entire world, where we were talking about parts, and we were talking about different messages of these parts. And she pulled back and said, "Oh my gosh, I just had a vision in my head of The Office in that episode where they're all pointing guns at each other." And it was this immediate awareness that there are all of these younger parts inside when something happens that are now at war with each other. And I was like, well, of course we can't. Like, how are you going to move? Because this one is saying this and this one is saying this, and they're completely at odds with each other. And both are in survival mode. So both are telling you, I have to do this thing or we'll die. And then you're stuck.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you're talking about the work you're doing with clients, what I have in mind is their life is going one way, their spirituality is going its own way, and that's how they are like in their present state. Um, but as they're some people will think about things as I'm just going to go to my therapist and work on my therapy stuff. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to do my church thing. But my read from what you're saying is that no, they're actually like much more connected.
Well,
And
I mean, I
so
think that
when you
yeah.
yeah, but when
I
you're
mean, I
seeing
think it
people,
speaks to all of us, right? Everything is so interconnected. Like body, mind, soul, spirit is so interconnected. How do you tease one out from the other?
Mhm. So when you see people progress clinically, so to speak, how do you see their spirituality evolve along with it?
Well, hopefully, I think it goes back to those stories. So, one of the things that we use in Soul Healing Love that is kind of really beautiful, we have something called a soul healogram, and it looks a lot like a genogram. And it's kind of a combination of genogram tools and imago tools because imago relationship theory, you look at what's called my imago, and the theory with imago relationship theory is that we all have this subconscious image of. That's what imago is, it's a great biblically because I could say, like imago Dei, image of God. This is one of the key principles theologically of creation. We are created in the image of God. Well, you will fall into relationships with people that have the positive and negative correlation, a high correlation of the positive and negative characteristics of your primary caregivers. With that, then we developed something called the soul healogram, which looks at not just you and your partner or people that you tend to date. If it's somebody that is single and we go, okay, look at like the last three partners and see what they were like. And then you go back several generations. We have them go to their great grandparents. And with great grandparents, they usually don't remember a lot. Then that's part one, where they do this grid of all the positive and negative characteristics of their family members. And then part two is a list of questions, and we want to get to the old brain. So, kind of like Freud with the free associations, like, do not think about this very long. Fill out this part. And then we have a list of questions as Soul Healing Love part two, or the Soul Healogram part two. And it says, so it's like, look at you just did all this work cognitively to put it on paper. Now don't go to the cognitive part of your brain. Just answer these questions after bringing some of that into your awareness. So some of the subconscious to actual conscious. And it's questions like, women in my family are, men in my family are, conflict in my family is, but a big, big, big one is, faith in my family is, religion in my family is, spirituality in my family is. So there's some that we have actually in our workbook, but if I have a sense that a client has had some religious trauma or that spirituality has been somewhat damaging for them, then I will throw in a few other questions. Like, let's just say like religion, let's say church. Let's say Bible study. So what is Bible study like in your family? Oh my gosh, it's like this hours long thing where like I have to confess to my elders and then they're telling me what to do. It's like, ooh, those are some stories in there, right? So when we do the part two, it's getting to those stories. It's getting to those trauma, beliefs, again, that are consistently informing us, whether we're aware of it or not. And so hopefully as we progress in therapy, what we're seeing is we're seeing just an integration and healthier thinking overall. I don't know if you guys have heard of Father Richard Rohr. So he's a big Enneagram teacher, but he also does a lot on mysticism and
Mhm.
spirituality. And think he's fantastic. But one of the things that he talks about, and as I heard him talking, I think I was reading one of his books or listening to a couple of podcasts. He said that in spirituality, a lot of times we keep people in a very black and white state. And it reminded me of Lawrence Kohlberg and the stages of moral development. So with moral development, Kohlberg had these stages where initially it's like black, white, right, wrong, good, bad, good girl, bad girl. And that I think it's 4 levels. I'm drawing on my memory now, but that the ultimate level is this integration where we take in a lot of information and then go, based on all of this, based on holding many, many things in space, now I make these decisions in my morality. But what Kohlberg found is that many, many people stay in that black and white, good girl, bad girl state. Good boy, good girl. And that's what as I was listening to Richard Rohr, I thought, oh my goodness, this is kind of what it seems like with spirituality is that we teach people, we promise them heaven for fear of hell. So it can be very fear-based. It can be very shame-based. It's something where they look at like, I did this, so I'm being punished versus like if the whole point, like Jesus had 12 disciples, not 12 convicts that he was punishing, right? He was teaching them. Like that's the whole point, which also, I mean, this pulls back to a real big like soapbox of mine these days is parenting styles, where, like you get older people who will push back at the gentle parenting styles. And I'm like, yes, but when we're punishing people, they're not actually learning. If we're disciplining our children so that we're teaching them, that's really different than being punitive, and also allows their brain to integrate so that they're making decisions based on many, many, many factors. I love dialectical behavioral therapy with that, right? It's not the black or white or the right and wrong. It's like the black and the white and every single shade of gray in between.
Yeah.
So, as I'm working with clients, I'm hoping that they're finding that in all areas of their life and really able to ask good, healthy, critical thinking strategies, even of pastors. I think a healthy pastor allows for that, right? Unfortunately, and there are a couple of books on narcissism in the church and many examples that we could, talk about right here, but
Yep.
that narcissistic culture doesn't allow for those challenges, and that's not healthy either.
What I find challenging is some people don't know what healthy spirituality looks like, or they disagree.
Mm.
Right. I would say probably if you talked to me when I was 18 or 17, and you told me, maybe we don't know what hell looks like. Like there's this really famous author, Rob Bell, and he got basically,
Oh, he got a lot of flack for
his
that.
church.
He got a lot of flack for
I
that,
think
but I was
hell
wrong for that.
is real, right? And yeah,
Yeah.
and so some people would say a healthy spirituality has hell and heaven, and if you don't live right, then you go to hell. And like that is like a true spirituality. And if it's not a true spirituality, it's not a healthy one.
Mhm.
But we can also see as therapists how like those types of spiritualities do lead to a lot of emotional pain and shame and breakdowns in their life. It just seems such a personal issue, though. And like,
Mhm.
so how do you approach that topic of spirituality with patients that view things differently than you in terms of like what is true and versus what is healthy?
Well, very, very sensitively, because everyone is in the space that they're in and the time that they're in for a reason. And so allowing like my job, I mean, ethically as well.
Mhm.
Number one is typically like I do have a biblical perspective. So there's a lot more aligned with what a lot of my clients are going to think than not. And I believe that to me, shame is just about the worst thing ever. So if you grew up like if somebody grew up in a shame space, which there are a lot, especially in the South,
Yeah.
a lot of shame-based theology. I am like real big on challenging it because first of all, from like a clinical perspective, shame we know leads to really negative outcomes. So shame, I am a bad person. I am horrible. I am awful. That is a space that is highly correlated with depression and anxiety, even suicidality. So that is just like unhealthy for everybody. Like it's just not good for you. Right now,
Mhm.
guilt, that's good, right? Guilt is I did something wrong. I've done something wrong and I need to change, right? It allows us to move to a space of change. So one of the first places that I will challenge them is in that shame guilt space, right? Is how do we move from like a shame space that you are so bad and you are awful to, oh, like I did something wrong. And then a lot of times I'll just bring in like just small examples. It's kind of like, like watering something a little bit at a time, right? Well, like, oh,
Mhm.
so that's what Jesus did. He came in and he told them how horrible they were. Definitely when they caught that woman in adultery, he picked up all the stones and he threw them at her, right? I mean, let's do it too. And then they go, right? They just sort of pause and they're trying, no, no. No, he didn't, actually. He told everybody to put them down. And so when you really begin to confront those stories with the person of Jesus, but again, it's a slow process, right? It's that, oh, And with that, of course, in my opinion, has to come a lot of body-based regulation, because from a body-based perspective, if I grew up in a space with a lot of shame-based theology, where am I probably living most of the time that I'm in church? We're probably in fight or flight consistently. And I'm hyper vigilantly walking through my life, categorizing everything that I do, terrified that I'm going to make a mistake. I
Mhm.
think what is a personal, this is personal, but a personal irritation of mine is the what is the word I'm looking for? Just the double standard, or like, we say one thing and we do another. It's like, so we will say from the pulpit very regularly that you are not perfect, and God knows that you are not perfect. And that is why Jesus died for you. And that is why he is here, because you are not perfect and you don't have to be perfect. And there is grace and no judgment. It's like my favorite, right? And then you walk out to the parking lot, and they're like condemning you for whatever just happened. And so it's sort of, I guess, two-faced. And to be fair to those people, they're not even seeing it. But then for us all to just pull back and have this awareness of like, we are saying one thing and we're doing a lot of times a complete other thing. And so I can't change a large church on its own necessarily, but what I can do is I can sit with that person and say, is that actually true? And,
Yeah.
is that accurate? Do those things line up? Oh, okay. Kind of
Mhm.
like back to what you were saying earlier, Dr. Hong, about like, does it line up with theology? Because another piece of it is, if I want to live a healthy Christian life like Jesus did, then no, I'm not perfect. And I can recognize that I'm perfectly imperfect. And I am going to strive to do better. So if I am partying all weekend long and I am hungover in church, that feels like a little bit of incongruence there. This is where those psychological principles come in again. Like, okay, well, help
Mhm.
me understand that. That's one of my favorite. Help me understand. And I do this a lot, as you can see in
Yeah.
the video. Like, I do the comparing hands. You got this on one side, you got this on the
Mhm.
other. Help me understand how those two meet, because I don't know, logically in my brain, they don't meet really well.
Totally. But it's totally normal to live this totally disconnected life. Like,
Yes.
I think more people live disconnected lives than live integrated lives. I
I
agree
think
with
that
that.
that's a whole other piece of something that I have really been, noticing lately. So with brain spotting, which is one of my great loves, the way that they look at trauma. So brain spotting, the quintessential piece of it is where you look affects how you feel. And there's a specific then eye position that we're looking for that's associated with with a memory or a feeling. And the way they look at it is that our brain kind of encapsulates trauma. So that's that dissociative piece of trauma. So it's in a capsule. As we look at that spot, it helps our limbic system open up and unwind that capsule. And then I've thought about this a lot lately with ADHD, because so much ADHD, and I mean, my
Mhm.
understanding too, like significant amount of ADHD in addiction because of the impulsivity and seeking for something to bring brain regulation, but so much ADHD. And certainly there is a genetic component, which can also be transgenerational trauma informed, which we know with
Mhm.
epigenetics. Um, but I've begun to look at like that, if ADHD is these many little moments of dissociation constantly, then there are a million and one of these capsules in our brains and in our nervous system that are locked off and they're not integrated. So then our brain is not talking to itself. And so, like you're saying, is we spend then the vast majority of our time completely dissociated and disconnected. And I've even seen it happen in session with people where we're talking about something like, let's talk about this thing that happened with your family. And they'll be sitting there and, they usually are some ADD, and I don't know, I forgot. I don't even know. It's like, oh, right there. That was the moment that you dissociated because your brain had a story that came from one of those trauma capsules that said, that is too hard to talk about. And so all of these methods and modalities, I think it's so critical to find things that bring integration. It's one of the reasons that I'm a huge proponent of meditation, because when you look at the neuroscience behind meditation, it is showing that it actually brings integration. Joe Dispenza has his 4-day workshops, and they do fMRIs of people. And by the 4th day, you actually see the integration in the whole brain. The whole brain is lit up. So it's like, we can't even argue with this at this point. Like, we're watching the scan of this is where the brain was before and this is where it is now, and it looks amazing. So we're bringing that integration where we can make informed decisions about all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would butcher the research, but I was recently listening to another podcast, and they were basically talking about the same thing. They were talking about the brain activity in brain scans of individuals that are just kind of the non-meditating individual, or maybe the novice, if you will, versus individuals that are highly skilled meditators, or also found very similar brain activity individuals that were like spiritual leaders. And just, I didn't see the scans myself, but just listening how they were talking about it, basically the same to what you were saying, just dramatic differences in the activity across the brain, certain areas that were more active with those individuals than others that were either, not meditating or just novelly meditating. Very interesting stuff for sure.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and it's like really cool research.
It is. It's very cool.
I think one idea that brings all these things together is this idea of a soul healing love. I love the name of that approach to therapy that the Rogers family has created, because I feel like when you talked about healthy spirituality, unhealthy spirituality, it kind of labels things, right? Like, your spirituality is wrong. It needs to be fixed. And it feels like a very distancing, judgy type of conversation to have. Whereas I think the idea of like soul healing love sounds very non-controversial. It sounds like something we would all love to have in our lives. So, but it all comes down to the details, right? So, what if you were to explain to somebody what is soul healing love and how it's used therapeutically, how would you explain this to someone who's a novice or a good potential client?
Yes. Well, so there's 2 different tracks. So there's the individual piece, and then there's the couples piece. Where it came from initially, soul healing love is really very heavily. So in the 90s, it is becoming a growing trend. I have met more therapists that are getting trained in Harville Hendrix imago relationship theory. I think for a very long time in marital work, John and Julie Gottman's work has come through, and Sue Johnson's emotion focused therapy, which are all fantastic. But in the 90s, my parents heard about imago relationship theory, and Harville is very heavily Freudian and Jungian. He's very psychoanalytic. So one of the underlying principles is that we all get pulled into these repetition compulsions, which is a Freudian defense mechanism, where we are compelled to repeat patterns from childhood in hopes that this time we'll get it better. So we do it to meet the needs that were met, and then find a way to meet the ones that weren't. So this is where that idea of the imago comes from, that I am drawn to the image of people who have the highest correlate to my primary caregivers, which is great if you have great family. But what if you don't? Or this is a big, big, big thing. And I actually said this to a couple the other day. I said, I just want to be exceptionally clear about something. I said, I have never met either of your parents. I said, but I have an utmost amount of respect for them. I have so much compassion for them. I have so much love for them. Nothing about this is blaming. That is not the goal at all. The goal is to bring awareness and understanding, because no parent is perfect. Goes back to like, how do we help ourselves not feel shameful about talking about our families, or also our parents to feel shame if we're bringing things to them. My son's been going through some things lately, and I was talking with a therapist friend about it, and she said, well, I mean, some of what you're explaining sounds like actions of avoidant attachment. And I mean, it was like I had to check myself, had to do my own deep breathing, because I'm like, like, to tell a therapist that their child has an avoidant attachment is like knife to the heart. But I didn't see it that way, but I did. I was like, okay, you're right. it was like the things that he's doing are, it's like, I'm hitting you, but I love you. I'm hitting you, but I love you. I'm like, yes, you're right. That is a little bit of that, ambivalent, avoidant. And I said, oh, I just don't know what I've done to do that. And it was a more reflective. It wasn't like, "Oh, I don't know what I've done." It was like, "Oh gosh, well, what have I done?" And it was beautiful. She said, "You know what? I like to really consider it's not what you've done." Now, if I had been in the therapist chair and someone had said this to me, it's like, yes, I would have gotten there. But as the mom, I'm like, "Oh gosh, what did I do?" But she said, "It's not what parents have done, it's the child's perception."
Mm.
So, with soul healing love, we look at what we call soul wounds. So, soul wounds are needs in childhood that did not get met. And when they're not met, because of the perception of children that, like, oh, somehow this is about me. I love what Gabor Mate says. He says, children are very narcissistic, not in a disordered sense, but in an egocentric state. So, everything that happens, they internalize as, what did I do that caused this? And it has to do with the way the brain develops. The younger we are, we don't have that other as much. So with a soul wound, it is a need in childhood that does not get met. When it does not get met, we internalize it as a basic fear that we carry about ourselves. And then we develop an adaptation to that. So I think addiction falls in line. I actually, one of my working theories of addiction, and I don't work specifically with addiction, but I like to talk with some gentlemen that you guys have actually had on the podcast. I'm good friends with Patrick Balsley and Robbie Shaw and some of these other addiction counselors in town. And I say, what do you think about this? But I think that the underlying root for most addiction is an initial self-abandonment, which I think comes from the need for support and connection that I didn't get. And so the only way to get it was to merge with another and go into that fawn response. And so I abandoned myself, and I'll do all kinds of things. I'll, a lot of times in brain spotting, Robbie Abels she has a fantastic model for addiction for brain spotting. And she talks about how you treat the substance addiction. But she says, then whenever I've treated the substance addiction, I have to get to the underlying addiction, because these folks have been abandoning themselves long before they could find a substance. And usually she finds it goes to food or sex. So are you an overeater, undereater, something like that? Because then that was what you were using to medicate. So back with soul healing love, then I will often use an example of the need for unconditional love. So if we all need unconditional love and acceptance, which, side note, sometimes is thwarted in spiritual circles, because again, it's that I say one thing, I do another. I say no matter what, I love you, but when you don't do what I want, I withdraw love, right? So it's like this confusion in the brain of like, wait, but is it or is it not? But when I have the need for unconditional love and acceptance and I don't receive that as a child, then I will internalize I'm not good enough. So my basic fear is this fear of inadequacy, this fear that I'm not good enough on some level. And then I'll find a way to adapt to it, because nobody wants to walk around feeling like they're unworthy constantly. So we find a way to adapt. So I say, same wound, same need, same wound, opposite adaptation. One person goes, I will never get anything wrong ever. I will always dot all my I's and cross all my T's. And their adaptation is perfectionism. So I'm going to make sure I get all the love that I need because I'm going to be perfect all the time. Another person goes, forget this. That's too hard. I'm going to do whatever the heck I want. So then you carry that adaptation, which works for a long time. It's just like an addiction. It works for a while until it doesn't. And particularly where it comes out is in relationships. So, if we're finding this, and then what happens is we tend to find people that have similar wounds, and because of the higher correlation to these characteristics of my primary caregivers, the people who are going to trigger me the most and send me to that old brain, are going to be my parents and my partner. And so one of the things that we do initially, when we mostly use it as a couples model, it was looking at how your soul wounds are keeping you from living in healthy harmony. Not only, initially we did a lot just like with each other, because it was more of a couples model. But then as you begin to look at that, I always tell people, no, they're like, well, so is it that my spouse is supposed to do this and they're going to, tell me that I'm good enough and meet my needs? We have various exercises. Or is it that I have to do it for myself? And I say, yes. And they're like, it's both. right? Because
Right.
not only do I need to, like, it's really wonderful to become aware that when me and my spouse have a horrendous argument over how you're supposed to fold a t-shirt and the correct way to do that, that when you peel back all the layers, what we're actually most likely, I mean, that we have some core issue that's hitting a soul wound. When there is a high level of reactivity, then you are not talking about the present. Right? It's kind of like what you guys were saying. If you have someone who comes in who's exceptionally resistant to spirituality, they're not talking about today. They're not talking what
Right.
they just heard about something spiritual right now. They're talking about an old story in that old brain.
Yep.
So, if you're fighting with your spouse over that, it feels really big. But the bigger reaction you have, the more emotion that you're giving a situation it's a clue that this is a story that comes from a soul wound. And so we use various tools to help them get in touch with that. From an individual standpoint, it's then when we become aware of those, I may not have somebody that's there to be that validating connection for me because, maybe the t-shirt is about, I don't feel heard, right? Like, I don't feel that my words matter to you. I'm telling you how I would like this done because it folds this way. It'll fit in the drawer. It just makes everything easier. And it seems silly, but it's actually a deeper need for connection and validation. So in relationships, we have something called the behavior change request. So we say, when we help you dig deeper, we have the digging deeper exercise. So like we argued about the t-shirt, you threw them across the room, you were very angry. Underneath that was actually some inadequacy and some fear of not being heard. And then it reminds you of the situation with your family growing up. And what do you really need? Well, what I really need is connection and validation. Okay. So then we put it into a behavior change request. How can your spouse help you feel heard and validated? So then came the question, well, what do we do if we're not in a relationship and no one's there? It's like, okay, well, the biggest thing, especially for self-abandoners, is to witness yourself. So how can you hear yourself and say, you know what, your method for this t-shirt folding, it's great. It's not the only way. Now that part, the out of the black and white thinking, as you both know, takes a lot more work in therapy. But
Yeah.
the ultimate goal is when we are understanding each other and seeing each other at a soul level, then that is when we are in flow to be able to move into the soul healing love of God. And on top of that is when we really recognize, like, truly how God sees us, that not only are we able to offer compassion to our partners, but we have it for ourselves. So, in the New Testament, there are 3 words for love. So we have just one word for love. I always say English is just so screwed up. We have so many words for so many things, but you love a hamburger just like you love your children. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. But in the New Testament, there's eros, which is a life force, life energy. There is phileo, which is friendship love. And there is agape, which is that unconditional love. Agape is what God has for us. When it talks about the love of God, it's that unconditional love. But in true soul healing, you've hit a disconnect somewhere. So you're not experiencing all of those. And our goal is that as we bring this awareness, as we bring some of this healing, as you work on your own stories that you're telling yourself for these soul wound messages, then that frees you up to move into all of those. So you have this beautiful picture of all of these forms of love, both for yourself and for others. And that's where the soul healing comes in.
So by experiencing love, people have the wounds of their soul healed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's beautiful.
Love from God, love for yourself, love from others. These are critical.
Mm,
Mhm.
that's really cool. That's very good. It's nice just hearing you talk through it, because I think these are things that maybe we know, but we don't never maybe stop to kind of think about what's broken and what it is that we actually need there. So that's very cool.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it makes it very challenging though for people in recovery. One of their biggest things is they don't know how to give love or
Mhm.
receive love in a healthy way.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people, they know how to blame other people for their problems, and they know how to create like a power through weakness. Like, I can't do that.
Right.
You have to do it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mhm.
if you don't do it for me, then you're harming me in some kind of way. And so it's like there's a fundamental brokenness about how they connect to other people. So I could see this being a real challenge in soul healing love, like how to
Mhm.
even access like that type of love in a healthy way that brings about the healing.
Yes. Well, and I think that's something that, as you know, as time goes on and as psychology continues to develop, uh, we add things. And so, we did actually do an in-person workshop in April, which was amazing. It was like, it was the first one in like 4 years. And one of the pieces that we added was talking about nervous system regulation. Because when I hear that, Dr. Wong, what my first thoughts at this point in what my training, like 5 years ago would have been different. At this point, what I hear is an inability of like a lack of window of tolerance. They need to grow the space to be able to even experience love. My mentor is fantastic, and we actually recorded an episode for our podcast, the Soul Healing Love podcast, that's going to come out in mid-August. Her name is Selene Souza, and she, along with another psychologist from Australia, Dr. Robbie Abels, created something called the MATES Brain Regulation Program. And it has some similarities to Dan Siegel's work. And also, they did not know about polyvagal theory at the time, but then learned about it. And it looks very similar, but they use a metaphor of a house. And they call that window of tolerance area our living area. And so when we're regulated, when we can notice things, then we're in our living area. If we go to fight or flight because of a trigger, we're in our attic. If we go to faint or freeze, we're in the basement. But one of the things, and Gottman points this out, but I think for me, it's a continued growing awareness. Like Gottman talks about self-soothe. So if you are teaching a couple of the Gottman method, you're going to say, okay, you got to self-soothe, you got to work on this. And so we have some really fantastic and powerful tools, one called the gift exercise and one called the digging deeper exercise, which I was actually talking through the digging deeper without giving it the words a few minutes ago. But those are cognitive strategies that will get you to a deeper level of emotion. So the gift exercise, the whole point is that anger is that more secondary reaction. Interestingly, I read Brene Brown, Atlas of the Heart, recently, and she was talking about anger. And she's like, okay, I can't exactly come to a consensus on people's research of whether anger is secondary or primary, but I think we can agree that when we're angry, we're also feeling a lot of other emotions. And so our goal with the gift exercise is to get you to the other emotions. Because when you're just talking in anger, that's all you're talking about. It's like, I'm so mad at you. And sometimes people are just in all out rage. So the gift says, what is underneath your anger? So when you're angry, are you experiencing guilt? So it's an acronym: inferiority or inadequacy, fear, or trauma? Is it reminding you of a past trauma, or are you hurting right now? Is it pain? So guilt, inferiority, fear, trauma. It's a gift exercise. The one thing about it, though, is you can't even talk about that until you found some nervous system regulation. And so this is where I go back to like a lot of those body-based strategies. Like, you know what? Everybody in this room, pause. This couple's interaction is getting real heated right now. Even my heart rate is going up right now. I'll say, let's just stop. We're all going to take deep breaths right now, because we can't talk about that until we move into that healthier space. But one of the things that she said as we were recording that would just stuck with me is she said, the thing about the living area is people are uncomfortable and they can't handle their discomfort, and they can't handle their comfort. And that was like this huge awareness as I've known her for years, and she said this today, and I was like, but it's so true, right? Because our nervous systems we are not only wired to do something with our discomfort, but what on earth do we do with our comfort? That's
Right.
foreign. So that's where some of those self-sabotaging parts will come back in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's So very true. I think that it echoes what you were just saying, Dr. Hong. I mean, like even when someone's trying to provide help for that person that's in crisis or that, dysregulated individual, that you're trying to provide help or support or love or connection. And like you said, continuously just kind of pushing that away. And I guess the opposite of that, rewinding to what you said about, these kind of two paths that someone could take, one being like perfectionism, if you will, or like over functioning, and then the other being,
Mhm.
this kind of other I could see that going the other way, because I think the other way that we see people present an addiction is, yes, either they're dysregulated, but they're pushing away the individuals that are trying to provide help and support, or it's the opposite of that, right? It's even though they are dysregulated, they don't want so they just want to do it by themselves, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know, the same,
Yeah.
but like a different kind of tone to it, right?
Yeah.
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 I think everyone's trying to find peace in some form or another.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, they don't really know what peace looks like.
Mm.
Like
Yes.
if you grow up in a very chaotic, fragile, volatile family and system, peace looks like those moments between the storm. And that's not really peace, actually.
Hmm.
And all these efforts to self soothe are totally foreign to people. But getting back to the core issue of spirituality, I think it is pretty understood that God wants, our higher power wants us to be at peace with the world that we are living in.
Mhm.
And what that actually looks like is everything fits together in a sustainable way. But how do we create those sustainable connections is something we didn't learn growing up in our chaotic families, but the Spirit longs for us to have it. And it's out there for us. We work with people who've been down this journey, been down this path, and they show us, they coach us on how to do it. And I think that those are spiritual moments when you're connecting with people and putting those pieces back together.
Well, I think too, something up, and I'm going to borrow this concept from someone else, so it's not original to myself. But uh, you were saying earlier in the conversation about, is your spirituality healthy or unhealthy?
Mm.
So this concept I'm going to borrow is that if we could reduce even spirituality just a little bit further, that maybe it's more about how we're living our life, right? It's how we're engaging with other people. It's the things that we're doing, the activities that we're doing. Are we engaging in things that are fulfilling, or are we engaging in things that are further dysregulating us? And I think the question can become at that point, like, is our way of life maybe healthy or unhealthy, right? And
Mhm.
that's just can maybe even just start with exactly that. Like, what are we doing with our time? What are we directing our attention and our focus on? And then maybe at some point we can introduce that maybe this is spirituality, or this can kind of
Mhm.
grow from that point, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, these are deep waters here on the New Waters podcast. I feel like this is only the beginning. We've only got into maybe the first 10 feet of where this topic could actually go.
Yes.
But I'm so happy we had this time to speak with you, Amanda, because you have a level of expertise that's so rare in both the therapy side and the spirituality side. And it's that connection between those two pieces that's so powerful for people to find healing in their life and get to this peacefulness that
Yeah.
we're all searching for. So thank you
Absolutely.
for joining us today. And we would love to highlight you as a resource. We'll put links to the podcast, to the practice, all in the show notes. So we encourage all of our listeners to make sure to dig into the show notes and find the Rogers Family Christian Counseling practice links there.
Yes. Well,
Thanks for
thank you
joining
so
us.
much. It's been an immense honor. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Amanda.
All right.